John Blackwood Jr. woke that morning with blood on his hands. Not his blood, not blood from any wound he could see or remember inflicting, but there it was, coating his palms, dried and dark, smelling of copper and something else, something ancient and accusatory. He stumbled from his bed in the plantation house, his heart hammering against his ribs, and when he looked down at his hands again, in the grey pre-dawn light, they were clean, completely clean, as if the blood had never existed at all. Except he could still smell it, could still feel the phantom weight of it between his fingers, could still hear a sound that made no rational sense, the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors somewhere in the house, though every enslaved person on the Blackwood, Georgia plantation was locked in their quarters until sunrise, as they had been every night for 3 generations. 3 days earlier, something had happened that would shatter the careful order of his family's world. Though John didn't understand it yet, didn't understand that what he'd witnessed wasn't just another routine transaction in the business of human bondage, but the beginning of a reckoning that would consume him completely. 3 days earlier, his father had sold a man named Matthew. Matthew had a brother. His name was Isaiah, and Isaiah had prayed to a God who apparently was tired of waiting for justice to arrive through conventional means. But before we descend into what became the haunting of John Blackwood Jr., before we explore how the sins of fathers can literally transfer into the eyes and flesh of their sons, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear isn't comfortable history. It's the kind of truth that gets buried because it forces us to confront how suffering doesn't just disappear when we choose to stop looking at it. Drop a comment telling us what you think happens when guilt becomes something more than psychological, when it becomes physical, undeniable, inescapable. We're building a community that doesn't look away from hard truths. The story begins 3 days before the blood that wasn't there. The Blackwood plantation in Georgia sprawled across 1,800 acres of rich soil that had been stolen from Creek Nation people 2 generations back and cultivated by enslaved labor ever since. Cotton grew in fields that stretched to horizons, white bowls ready for harvest under a sun that burned without mercy. John Blackwood Sr. ran the operation with brutal efficiency, as his father had before him, maintaining productivity through a system of carefully calibrated violence and psychological control that he genuinely believed was ordained by divine providence and natural law. He had 5 children. John Jr. was the oldest, 24 years old that autumn of 1859, being groomed to inherit the entire operation, being taught that human beings could be property, that some people were simply born to serve, that the screams you heard from the punishment shed were regrettable necessities of maintaining order, that you could split families apart for profit and sleep soundly afterward if you just didn't think about it too hard. Among the 237 people his father claimed ownership over were 2 brothers, Isaiah and Matthew. They'd been born on the plantation 28 and 26 years ago, respectively, sons of a woman named Rebecca, who'd died of fever when Isaiah was 12. The brothers had survived by protecting each other, by maintaining a bond so fierce that even the most brutal overseers had learned it was easier to assign them to work together than deal with the drop in productivity when they were separated. They worked the cotton fields from sunup to sundown. They lived in a cabin barely large enough for 2 people to lie down in. They ate rations calculated to maintain strength without comfort. They watched people they loved sold away, whipped into submission, broken by a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum humanity. And they survived because they had each other. Until they didn't. October 3rd, 1859. John Blackwood Sr. received a letter from a tobacco plantation in Virginia offering an exceptional price for strong male workers under 30. The tobacco operation was expanding, needed experienced field hands, and was willing to pay premium rates. Blackwood Sr. reviewed his human inventory with the same calculation he'd use evaluating livestock. Matthew was slightly stronger than Isaiah, had fewer scars from punishment, meaning he'd be easier to sell at top price. The decision took less than 5 minutes. Business was business. Sentiment had no place in profitable plantation management. John Jr. stood on the main house porch that morning and watched his father inform Matthew of the sale. Watched Isaiah's face transform from confusion to comprehension to a horror so complete it seemed to stop time itself. Watched Matthew reach for his brother and be struck down by an overseer for the presumption of unauthorized movement. Watched Isaiah fall to his knees in the dirt, not from a blow, but from the sheer weight of understanding that the only anchor keeping him connected to humanity was about to be torn away forever. The brothers were given 10 minutes together before Matthew was loaded onto a wagon for transport to the rail depot. 10 minutes to compress 26 years of shared survival, shared grief, shared hope into words that could never be adequate. John Jr. couldn't hear what they said to each other, but he saw Isaiah's lips moving in what looked like prayer as the wagon pulled away. Saw Matthew's face pressed against the wooden slats, eyes locked on his brother, until distance and dust made seeing impossible. That night, Isaiah knelt in his cabin and spoke to a God he'd been taught about by the same people who claimed divine sanction for his enslavement. The same God who supposedly loved all his children, while apparently tolerating some of his children being bought and sold like furniture. Isaiah's faith had always been complicated, a mixture of Christianity imposed from above and older beliefs whispered by the eldest among the enslaved. Beliefs about justice and balance and debts that must eventually be paid. He didn't pray for Matthew's return. He knew that wasn't how this world worked. He prayed for something else entirely, for understanding, for the people who did these things to somehow comprehend what they were doing, to feel it, to carry it, to understand that every casual cruelty, every family torn apart, every human being reduced to property, all of it was being recorded somewhere, somehow, and payment would eventually come due. "Let them see," Isaiah whispered into the darkness of his cabin. "Let them see what they've done. Let them carry what we carry. Let them understand what it means to be ripped apart. Let them know." Something heard him. Maybe it was God. Maybe it was something older. Maybe it was just the universe itself, which has its own sense of balance, its own way of ensuring that evil doesn't get to exist without consequence forever. Whatever it was, it answered. Not with words, not with thunder or divine pronouncement, but with a subtle shift in reality, a crack in the careful separation that allowed men like the Blackwoods to commit atrocities without having to actually experience the human cost. A crack that would widen into a chasm. And John Blackwood Jr., the heir to all this blood-soaked prosperity, would be the first to fall through it. He woke the next morning feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, just different. Like something inside him had shifted position. Like he was looking at the world through eyes that weren't quite his own anymore. He dressed for breakfast, descended the stairs of the plantation house, and walked into the dining room where his mother had laid out eggs and ham and fresh bread. Simple food, but abundant. More than any enslaved person on the property would eat in a week. He sat down, picked up his fork, and that's when it started. The ham on his plate wasn't just meat anymore. He could see the pig it came from, could see further than that, could see the hands that had slaughtered it, butchered it, prepared it. Hands that belonged to a man named Solomon who'd been purchased 3 years ago and worked in the kitchen house. Hands that were scarred from years of labor. Hands that had once held children before those children were sold to a plantation in Alabama. John could see those children, could see their faces, could see Solomon's face the day they were taken. A grief so massive it had no name in English. A grief that went beyond tears into some frozen wasteland where feeling itself became impossible because the alternative was death. He dropped his fork. It clattered against the china plate. His mother looked up from her own breakfast. "Are you unwell, John?" He couldn't answer, because now he was seeing other things. The table they sat at had been built by a man named Josiah, who'd been beaten to death 2 years ago for taking an extra piece of bread. John could see that beating, could see every blow, could feel them somehow, phantom impacts against his own ribs, his own spine. The chair he sat in had been finished with oil rubbed in by hands that belonged to a woman who'd watched her daughter sold away at age 11. John could see that daughter's face, could hear her screaming for her mother as the wagon pulled away, could feel that mother's heart literally breaking, tissue tearing, pain beyond physical. "John?" His mother's voice seemed to come from very far away. He stood abruptly. The room spun, because now he could see them all. Every person his family claimed ownership over. Every face, every story, every moment of suffering. It was all there, layered over reality like a second world occupying the same space as the first. He stumbled from the dining room and made it outside before vomiting into the azalea bushes, his body trying to expel something that wasn't physical, that couldn't be purged through any biological process. When he straightened up, wiping his mouth, he saw Isaiah walking toward the cotton fields with the morning work gang. And when their eyes met across 40 yards of distance, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. Isaiah knew. Somehow he knew that his prayer had been answered, that the burden was being transferred, that John Blackwood Jr. was beginning to see. The visions didn't stop. They followed John through that day and into the night. Every surface in the plantation house carried memories of the hands that had built it, maintained it, cleaned it. The wallpaper had been hung by a man who'd been sold away from his wife. The floors had been polished by a woman whose son had been worked to death in the fields at age 16. The curtains had been sewn by fingers that had been broken as punishment for moving too slowly. John saw it all, couldn't stop seeing it. It was like someone had removed a filter from his perception, had forced him to acknowledge what had always been there, but what he'd been trained to ignore. The human cost of his comfort, the suffering that underwrote every moment of his privileged existence. That night, he tried to sleep and found himself trapped in dreams that weren't dreams, were more like memories that didn't belong to him. He was being dragged from his home by men with rifles. He was being stripped and examined like livestock. He was being chained to a line of other people and force-marched hundreds of miles. He was being sold on an auction block while buyers examined his teeth and muscles. He was being whipped until skin broke and blood ran. He was being torn away from everyone he loved and told he'd never see them again. He was all of these things. Living all of these experiences simultaneously, the accumulated trauma of generations of enslaved people flooding into his consciousness with an intensity that made rational thought impossible. He woke screaming, found himself standing in the middle of his bedroom, drenched in sweat, his hands raised as if to ward off blows that weren't falling. And on his wrists, he could see marks, red impressions like he'd been wearing iron shackles. Except he hadn't been. There were no shackles, just the marks they'd leave. Just his body, manifesting what his mind was being forced to witness. He went to his mirror and looked at his reflection in the candlelight. For just a moment, it wasn't his face looking back. It was Matthew's face. Matthew, who'd been sold away. Matthew, whose separation from Isaiah had triggered something that was now consuming John from the inside out. The face in the mirror looked at him with infinite sadness and something else. Something like justice finally arriving after centuries of delay. The next morning at breakfast, John's father noticed his son's condition. "You look terrible, boy. Are you coming down with something?" John wanted to explain, wanted to tell his father about the visions, the memories, the overwhelming flood of suffering that he couldn't escape. But how do you explain to a man who's built his entire life around not seeing, around maintaining comfortable blindness to the human cost of his wealth? How do you tell him that the filter is gone, that you can see what he spent 60 years avoiding? "I'm fine," John lied. "Just didn't sleep well." His father grunted and returned to reading the newspaper. A newspaper printed on paper made by enslaved labor, with ink mixed by enslaved labor, delivered by enslaved labor. John could see all of it now, could see the hands that had touched every object in this house, could see the suffering encoded in every comfort. And he knew this was only the beginning, knew that whatever had been set in motion by Isaiah's prayer was just getting started, that the visions would get worse, that the physical manifestations would intensify, that he was being forced to carry what his family had inflicted on others for 3 generations. And there would be no escape. Because you can't run from knowledge once you truly have it. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't go back to comfortable ignorance once the truth has shattered the carefully constructed lies. John Blackwood Jr. was learning that lesson in the most visceral way possible. Was learning that guilt isn't always metaphorical. Sometimes it becomes literal. Sometimes it writes itself on your body, invades your dreams, transforms your perception until you can't tell where you end and the suffering you've witnessed begins. He thought about Matthew and Isaiah, thought about 10 minutes of goodbye to compress a lifetime, thought about Isaiah's prayer. Let them see, let them understand, let them carry what we carry. The prayer was being answered, and John was starting to understand that this was only the first layer of what was coming, that the true depth of the curse, if that's what it was, hadn't even begun to reveal itself yet. That night, he dreamed of mirrors, hundreds of them, thousands, each one showing a different face, different eyes, all the people his family had owned over 3 generations, all of them looking at him, all of them saying without words, "We see you now. We've always seen you, and now you finally see us. And you'll never stop seeing us. Never stop carrying us. Never stop understanding what you've done." The dream didn't feel like sleeping. It felt like waking up for the first time in his life. Waking up to a reality that had always been there, but that he'd been protected from by privilege and deliberate ignorance. That protection was gone now. burned away by something that wouldn't accept willful blindness anymore, wouldn't let him hide behind abstractions and economic justifications, wouldn't let him be comfortable while others suffered. He woke with tears streaming down his face, found himself whispering words he didn't remember choosing. I see you. I see you. I see you all. And he did. God help him, he did. 3 days after Matthew was sold, 3 days after Isaiah prayed, 3 days after the crack in reality opened wide enough to let truth flood through. John Blackwood, Jr. stood on the porch of his family's plantation house and looked out at fields worked by people he was beginning to understand he'd never actually seen before. Not really. Not as fully human. And he felt something that his father had never felt, that his grandfather had never felt, that none of the men who'd built this empire of cotton and suffering had ever let themselves feel. He felt their pain. Not abstractly, not intellectually, but viscerally, undeniably, as real as his own heartbeat. And he knew, with terrible certainty, that this was permanent. That whatever had been done to him couldn't be undone. That he would carry this for the rest of his life. He looked toward the quarters where Isaiah lived, saw the man standing in his doorway, watching the main house. Their eyes met again across the distance, and Isaiah nodded once, slowly. A gesture that could have meant many things: acknowledgement, confirmation, or perhaps just the simple statement that had been silent for so long but was finally being spoken. Now you know. Now you understand. Now you carry what we've always carried. Welcome to the truth. And John understood that this was just the beginning, that the visions would intensify, that the physical manifestations would multiply, that he was being transformed into a living record of his family's crimes. A walking testimony to suffering that could no longer be ignored or explained away or justified through comfortable lies. He went back inside, walked past his mother arranging flowers, flowers grown in soil fertilized by the labor of people she'd never once considered fully human. Walked past his father's study, where ledgers recorded human beings as assets and expenses. Walked past rooms filled with furniture and art and comfort built on foundations of systematic cruelty. And he saw it all now. Every object, every comfort, every privilege, all of it stained with blood and tears and suffering that he could no longer unsee. That night, the dreams intensified. He wasn't just witnessing anymore. He was experiencing, was living through auction block examinations, was feeling the whip cut into his back, was being torn from loved ones and told he had no right to his own family, his own children, his own humanity, was being reduced to property, to a thing, to merchandise that could be bought and sold and used up and discarded. Every horror that the enslaved had endured, he endured, in dreams so vivid they left physical marks. He woke with scars that hadn't been there when he fell asleep, woke with bruises from beatings that never happened to his body, but had happened to hundreds of bodies just like his. Woke, screaming words in languages he didn't speak, prayers and curses and grief from people whose memories were somehow flooding into him. His mother found him one morning, curled in a corner of his room, rocking back and forth, whispering names. Names of people who'd been sold, who'd died, who'd been separated from everyone they loved. Names he shouldn't know but somehow did. Names that poured out of him like water from a broken vessel.
John, what's wrong with you?
She was frightened now, could see that something was happening to her son that went beyond illness, beyond anything she had framework to understand. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held reflections of people she'd walked past every day without truly seeing. I know their names, Mother. All of them. Every person we've owned. Every person Father's owned. Every person Grandfather owned. I know their names and their stories and what was done to them. And I can't stop knowing. Can't stop seeing. Can't stop feeling what they felt. She backed away from him, called for his father, called for the doctor, because this was madness, clearly. This was some kind of breakdown that medicine could fix, that rest and proper treatment could cure. She couldn't conceive that it might be something else entirely, something that medicine had no power over, something that was actually justice arriving in a form she'd never anticipated. The doctor came, examined John, found nothing physically wrong except the marks, the bruises, the scars that appeared and disappeared and reappeared in patterns that made no medical sense. He prescribed laudanum for sleep and rest and quiet, told the family that John was clearly suffering from some form of nervous exhaustion, that the responsibilities of inheritance were weighing too heavily on a sensitive mind, that time and isolation would restore him to health. But the doctor was wrong. Time made it worse. Isolation made it worse. Because every moment alone was a moment where the visions could intensify, where the memories that weren't his could flood in without distraction, where he had to confront what his family had done, what his society had done, what he himself had participated in through passive acceptance and willful ignorance. 4 days after Matthew was sold, John stopped being able to eat. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. More than that, every meal reminded him of rations calculated to maintain slavery, of people going hungry while others feasted, of children who'd never known a full stomach. He couldn't swallow past the knowledge of disparity, couldn't consume comfort when he could see so clearly the suffering that underwrote it. 5 days after Matthew was sold, John stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. The dreams were too intense, too real, too overwhelming. He'd wake from nightmares of separation and find himself sobbing for children he'd never met, but whose grief he could feel as if it were his own. 6 days after Matthew was sold, the servants began to fear him, because when John looked at them now, they could see in his eyes that he knew their stories, knew their pain, knew their names and their losses and their survival. It was unnatural. It was wrong, according to every rule of how the world was supposed to work. It violated the careful separation between owner and owned, between master and slave, between those who could afford to ignore suffering and those who had to endure it. 7 days after Matthew was sold, John's father decided that enough was enough, called the doctor back, demanded stronger medication, demanded that his son be restored to the proper state of mind for a plantation heir, demanded that whatever was wrong be fixed immediately because cotton harvest was approaching, and he needed John functioning, needed him ready to take over operations, needed him to be what he'd been raised to be. The doctor looked at John, at eyes that held too much knowledge, at a face that seemed to be aging in real time under the weight of what it was being forced to witness. And for just a moment, the doctor felt something like fear, because he'd seen eyes like that before, in the enslaved, in people who'd endured so much suffering that something fundamental in them had changed. But he'd never seen those eyes in a white man before. Never seen that depth of pain in someone who wasn't supposed to have access to it. He prescribed stronger laudanum, prescribed isolation from plantation operations, prescribed quiet and dark rooms and minimal stimulation. All the standard treatments for nervous disorders, none of which would touch what was actually wrong. None of which could address a curse that was designed to teach empathy through the most brutal method possible: direct experience. 8 days after Matthew was sold, John stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom, and for a full minute, his reflection wasn't his own. It was Isaiah's face looking back at him, Isaiah's eyes, Isaiah's expression of grief so profound it had transcended individual experience and become something universal. The face in the mirror spoke, though the lips didn't move in the way speech usually requires. You wanted to know what it feels like. Now you know. You wanted to understand what we carry. Now you understand. This is the burden we've always carried, the knowledge of our own humanity in a world that denies it. The pain of being reduced to property, the grief of separation, the rage of injustice, all of it. You're carrying all of it now, and you'll carry it for the rest of your life. The reflection changed, became Matthew's face, then another face John didn't recognize, then another, then hundreds of faces, thousands, flowing through the mirror like water, each one a person who'd been enslaved on Blackwood land over 3 generations, each one leaving an impression, each one adding their weight to what John was being forced to carry. He backed away from the mirror, fell against his bed, and whispered into the empty room, "I understand. God help me, I understand now." But understanding wasn't enough. Understanding was just the beginning. The visions were intensifying. The physical manifestations were multiplying. And John was starting to realize that this wasn't something that would peak and then subside. This was something that would continue to grow, that would transform him completely, that would hollow him out and fill the empty space with the accumulated suffering of everyone his family had brutalized. He thought about Isaiah's prayer. Let them see. Let them understand. Let them carry what we carry. And he realized that the prayer hadn't been about revenge exactly. It had been about justice, about forcing those who committed atrocities to actually comprehend what they'd done, to experience it, to carry it, to live with it, the way the enslaved had always lived with it, without the luxury of turning away, without the privilege of ignorance, without the comfortable blindness that made participation in evil possible. John Blackwood Jr. was learning what it meant to see, really see. And he was discovering that once you truly see suffering, once you genuinely comprehend it, you can never go back to not seeing. The filter is gone. The protection is gone. You're left exposed to the reality of what's been done. And if you have any humanity left, any capacity for empathy, any functioning conscience, that reality will destroy you. He looked out his window toward the slave quarters, saw smoke rising from cooking fires as people prepared their minimal evening meals after 14 hours of forced labor, saw children playing in the dirt because childhood persists even in hell, saw Isaiah standing alone, looking toward the main house, looking toward John. And even across the distance, John could feel the weight of that gaze, could feel the question it asked. Do you understand now? Do you finally see? And John whispered to the glass, to the gathering darkness, to whatever force was transforming him. Yes, I see. I see everything, and I don't know how to live with what I'm seeing. The answer came not in words, but in another wave of visions, another flood of memories, another layer of suffering adding itself to the burden he was being forced to carry. And John understood that this was the point, that living with it was exactly what he was being required to do, that there was no escape, no relief, no return to comfortable ignorance, that he would carry this knowledge for the rest of his life, however long or short that life turned out to be, and that the carrying itself was the punishment, the lesson, the justice that had been prayed for. 9 days after Matthew was sold, John Blackwood, Jr. stopped being the person he'd been raised to be and became something else entirely. Became a witness, became a carrier of memory, became a living testament to suffering that could no longer be denied or explained away. Became the answer to a prayer that had asked for those who inflicted pain to finally understand what pain actually meant. The transformation was just beginning. The worst was still to come. But already he could feel himself being hollowed out, could feel his old self, his comfortable self, his privileged, ignorant self, being burned away to make room for something that was both more and less than human. More in that he was being forced to expand his capacity for empathy beyond what he'd thought possible. Less in that he was losing the ability to function in the world he'd been born into, the world that required not seeing, not knowing, not caring. He closed his eyes that night and whispered into the darkness, "I see you. I see you all. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And the darkness whispered back, in voices that might have been memory, might have been curse, might have been simple truth, finally allowed to speak. Sorry isn't enough. Understanding isn't enough. You have to carry what we've carried. You have to live with what we've lived with. You have to know what it means to be seen as less than human. And you have to carry that knowledge until it breaks you, the way it's broken us, the way it's broken everyone who's ever been enslaved. Welcome to the truth, John Blackwood. Welcome to the burden. Welcome to what we've always known. 10 days after Matthew was sold, John stopped speaking to his family entirely. There was nothing to say. They existed in different realities now. They could still choose not to see. He couldn't. They could still maintain comfortable distance from the human cost of their wealth. He couldn't. They could still function in a system designed to extract labor and inflict suffering. He couldn't. He was changing, being changed, being transformed into something his family wouldn't recognize, something his world had no category for. A white man who could see enslaved people as fully human. 16 days after Matthew was sold, John Blackwood, Jr. sat in his locked room at the Charleston Sanatorium and felt the walls beginning to breathe. Not metaphorically, actually breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. Like the room itself had become a living thing, or like he'd become so sensitized to suffering that he could perceive the trauma embedded in the building materials. The sanatorium had been constructed 20 years earlier using enslaved labor. John could see them now, the men who'd laid the bricks, the women who'd mixed the mortar, the children who'd carried water, could see their hands, their faces, their exhaustion, could feel the overseer's whip driving them to work faster. could taste their fear of punishment for insufficient speed. The walls remembered. Buildings remember. Stone and brick and wood absorb the pain of those who build them. And John could read that pain now, like text written in blood. A new attendant arrived that morning. Young man, couldn't have been more than 20. He brought breakfast on a tray and set it on the small table without looking at John, without acknowledging him as human, just performing a task, feeding the patient, completing the duty. But when their eyes met accidentally, the attendant froze, because John's eyes had changed, had become something other than they'd been, had become windows into accumulated centuries, mirrors reflecting suffering the attendant had spent his whole life not seeing. The young man backed toward the door, fumbling with his keys, and John spoke for the first time in days. His voice was rough, unused, but clear. "You have a sister. Her name is Rachel. She's 14. Your family sold her last month to pay debts." The attendant's face went white. "How could you possibly know that?" John didn't answer the question. Instead, he continued, "You tell yourself she's better off on the new plantation, that the family who bought her seems kind, that she'll be treated well. But you wake up at night wondering if she's crying for you, if she feels abandoned, if she understands you had no power to stop it. You carry that guilt every day. It's eating you from the inside." "Stop it!" The attendant's voice cracked. "Stop talking! I can see it in you." John stood slowly. "The same way I can see it in everyone now. The suffering you've witnessed, the compromises you've made, the humanity you've learned to ignore so you can function in this system. You're not evil, you're just surviving. But survival, built on others' suffering, still leaves marks, still creates debts that have to be paid somehow." The attendant fled, left the breakfast tray, left the door unlocked in his haste to escape. And John stood in the center of his room, understanding something new. The curse wasn't just about him experiencing enslaved people's suffering. It was about him becoming able to see that suffering in everyone, to perceive the guilt and compromise and moral injury that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver, victim and perpetrator. The whole society was poisoned. The whole system created wounds that infected everyone, regardless of their position in it. And John could see those wounds now, could see them festering in every person he encountered, could see how slavery didn't just destroy the enslaved, it destroyed the humanity of everyone who participated in it, corroded their ability to feel, to empathize, to recognize suffering when it stood right in front of them. He walked to the unlocked door, opened it, stepped into the hallway. The sanatorium was quiet, mid-morning. Most patients sedated, most attendants occupied elsewhere. John walked down the corridor, and with each step he saw more. Saw the enslaved people who'd built this building, saw the patients who'd been locked away for inconvenient truths, saw the attendants who'd learned to see human beings as problems to be managed, saw the whole architecture of denial and control, saw how it all connected, how the sanatorium was just another manifestation of the same system, different methods, same purpose, containing what threatens order, hiding what challenges comfortable lies. He reached the main entrance. The door was locked, but he could see through the glass to the street beyond. could see Charleston going about its business, people buying and selling, building and trading, living their lives on foundations of systematic cruelty they'd learned not to see. And John understood that what was happening to him wasn't just personal, wasn't just about one man being forced to witness suffering. It was about the impossibility of maintaining the system once you truly saw it, once you genuinely understood what it cost. The system depended on blindness, on separation, on the ability of some people to experience comfort without having to witness the suffering that created that comfort. Remove that separation, and the whole structure became unbearable, became impossible to participate in, became something that had to either change or destroy those who could see it clearly. A hand grabbed his shoulder, attendant, larger than the young one who'd fled. This one was used to handling difficult patients, had learned to see them as less than human, so he could do what needed doing without emotional interference. "Come on now, back to your room. You're not well enough to be wandering about." John turned and looked at the man, really looked, saw beneath the professional exterior to the person underneath. Saw a man who'd started this work with good intentions, who'd wanted to help people, who'd been slowly corrupted by a system that required cruelty disguised as care, who'd learned to hurt people while telling himself it was for their own good, who carried guilt he didn't acknowledge, who drank himself to sleep most nights trying to quiet voices in his head that asked if he'd become the kind of man he used to despise. "I see you," John said quietly. "I see who you were before this place changed you. I see who you could have been if you'd worked in a system that valued healing over control. I see the person you've buried so deep you've almost forgotten he existed." The attendant's grip loosened. His face showed confusion, fear, something that might have been recognition. "How are you doing this? How can you see those things?" "Because someone prayed for sight, prayed for understanding, prayed for those who inflict suffering to finally comprehend what they're doing. And I'm the answer to that prayer. I see everything now, every compromise, every rationalization, every moment someone chose comfort over conscience. I see it all, and I'll never stop seeing it." The attendant backed away, left John standing in the entrance hall, and John understood he could leave, could walk out the door, could escape this confinement. But where would he go? Back to the plantation, where every object screamed with the suffering embedded in it? Into a city built on enslaved labor, where every street corner held ghosts? Into a society organized around denying the humanity of people he could now see more clearly than he saw himself? There was no escape. Not because of locked doors, because of open eyes. Because once you truly see, every place becomes unbearable. Every system reveals its cruelty. Every comfortable space exposes the suffering it rests on. He walked back to his room, sat on the bed, and waited for what he knew was coming. The next layer, the next revelation, the next impossible burden. 17 days after Matthew was sold, the dead began speaking to him. Not metaphorically, not in dreams or visions. Actually speaking, voices in the air, words that formed from nothing, testimony that wouldn't stay silent anymore. He woke that morning to find his room crowded with presences, could see them now, translucent figures, overlapping realities. The enslaved who died on Blackwood land, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all there, all watching, all waiting to be acknowledged. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, or didn't step exactly, moved in a way that suggested walking without requiring physical motion. She'd been young when she died, maybe 25. Her dress was simple, worn, the kind enslaved women wore in the fields. And when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the air itself, from the walls, from inside John's own skull. "My name was Sarah. I died giving birth, 1832. My baby died with me. Your grandfather wouldn't pay for a midwife, said it was an unnecessary expense, said enslaved women had been giving birth without help for generations, said nature would take its course. I labored for 3 days, screaming, bleeding, begging for help that never came. When I finally died, they buried me and my baby in unmarked graves behind the quarters. Didn't even stop work for the burial. Just had 2 men dig the hole during their lunch break and move on. Like we'd never existed. Like our lives had no value. Like our deaths didn't matter." John tried to speak, couldn't find words. The woman continued. "But we did exist. We did matter. And now you're going to carry us, going to remember us, going to be the testimony that we were human, that we loved, that we suffered, that we died in pain because people who claimed to be Christian decided our lives weren't worth the cost of a midwife. You're going to carry that knowledge, and it's going to destroy the comfortable lies your family built their fortune on." Another figure moved forward, an old man, his back bent from years of field labor. When he spoke, his voice crackled like dry leaves. "I was Jacob, worked Blackwood land for 67 years, from age 6 until I died at 73. Never saw a penny, never had a choice, never owned anything except the scars on my back. When I got too old to work full days, they reduced my food rations, said I wasn't earning my keep anymore. I starved to death slowly. Took 6 months. Every day a little weaker. Every day a little closer to the end. And I died, knowing that after 67 years of labor, my death was seen as a relief. One less mouth to feed, one less problem to manage. Your family held a party the week I died. I could hear the music from the quarters, could hear people laughing while I was dying from hunger they'd imposed. And nobody cared. Nobody even noticed. One by one, they came forward. One by one, they spoke. Each testimony adding to the weight John was carrying. Each story revealing the human cost of the system his family had profited from. A child who'd been sold at age 8. A man who'd been beaten to death for talking back. A woman who'd been forced to become her owner's concubine. A young man who'd tried to escape and been hanged as an example. On and on. An endless parade of suffering, of humanity denied, of lives reduced to property and discarded when no longer profitable. And John listened to all of it, absorbed all of it, felt each testimony carve itself into his consciousness, felt the weight of all those lives, all those deaths, all that suffering accumulating until he could barely breathe under it, until his heart felt like it would stop from the sheer mass of pain it was being forced to hold. When the testimonies finally ended, when the last ghost had spoken, Sarah stepped forward again. "Now you know. Now you carry us. Now you understand what your family built their wealth on. Not just cotton, not just land, but corpses, stolen lives, suffering turned into profit. Your entire existence has been funded by our deaths. Your education, your clothes, your food, your future. All of it purchased with our blood. And you can never unknow that, can never unsee it, can never go back to comfortable ignorance. You're ours now, belong to us, are marked by us, and you'll carry us until the day you die. And even then, I suspect, you'll carry us beyond death. Because some debts don't end with dying. Some accounts remain open forever. The figures faded. The room returned to normal. Or what passed for normal in a world where ghosts testified and dead voices demanded accounting. John lay on his bed, feeling like he'd been hollowed out, like everything that had been him before had been scooped away to make room for the dead, for their stories, for their demands, for their refusal to stay silent anymore. He understood now what the curse was doing. Wasn't just punishing him, was transforming him into a living memorial, a walking graveyard, a person-shaped repository for all the people his family had destroyed, was making him carry them so they wouldn't be forgotten, so their suffering would be remembered, so their humanity would be testified to, even though the official records ignored them, erased them, treated them as property without names or stories or value. 18 days after Matthew was sold, John's father arrived at the sanatorium. Came in a fine carriage, dressed in expensive clothes, purchased with money earned from enslaved labor. He sat across from John in the small room and looked at his son with a mixture of disgust and concern. The doctors say you're not improving, say you've developed delusions, say you speak in tongues and claim to see ghosts. This is intolerable, John. You're embarrassing the family, making us look weak, making me look like I've raised a son who can't handle the responsibilities of his position. John looked at his father, really looked, saw beneath the stern exterior to the fear underneath. Fear that John's condition was somehow contagious, that seeing the truth might be transferable, that the comfortable lies might collapse if examined too closely. And John saw something else, saw the ghosts that surrounded his father, saw the enslaved people his father had owned, sold, beaten, broken. Saw them crowding around him, touching him, trying to make him feel what they'd felt. But his father had built such strong barriers, had developed such perfect blindness, that he couldn't perceive them even though they pressed against him from all sides. "Can you see them, Father?" John asked quietly. "Can you see the people standing around you? The ones you've hurt? The ones you've killed through neglect and cruelty and the systematic extraction of their humanity?" "There's no one here except us." His father's voice was sharp. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. These delusions, this madness. You need stronger treatment, need to be brought back to reality." "This is reality, Father. This is what we've been avoiding, what we've been trained not to see. But it's always been there, always been real. We just had the privilege of looking away, of not having to confront what we were doing. But I can't look away anymore. The filter is gone, and I see everything. Every person you've owned, every family you've split apart, every child sold for profit, Every beating justified as discipline. Every death dismissed as the natural cost of doing business. I see all of it, and you should too. You should be forced to see what I see, to feel what I feel, to carry what I'm carrying. His father stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. I won't listen to this blasphemy, won't tolerate this weakness. You are my son. You are a Blackwood, and you will recover your senses and return to your duties, or you will be permanently removed from the family. Do you understand? You have a choice to make. Return to who you were raised to be, or lose everything. Your inheritance, your name, your place in society. Everything. John looked at his father and felt something like pity. Felt how trapped the man was in his own lies, how dependent on blindness, how terrified of seeing truth, because truth would destroy everything he'd built his identity around. And John understood that no words would reach him. No testimony would break through the armor he'd constructed. He'd die blind. Would go to his grave never acknowledging what he'd done, never comprehending the human cost of his prosperity, never allowing himself to feel the weight of all those lives he'd destroyed. I can't go back, John said simply. Can't unsee what I've seen. Can't unfeel what I've felt. Can't deny the humanity of people I now understand more deeply than I understand myself. Whatever you decide to do with me, that won't change. I'm transformed, and transformation isn't reversible. Then you're no son of mine. His father's voice was cold, final, absolute. I'll have the papers drawn up. You'll be removed from the will. The family line will pass to your brother. You'll have nothing, be nothing. Just another madman locked away from polite society. Is that what you want? To throw away everything for delusions and ghosts? They're not delusions, Father. They're testimony. They're truth. They're the reality we built our fortune on. And yes, I'd rather have truth and nothing else than have everything built on lies. His father left without another word, without looking back, without acknowledging that he'd just severed the family tie, just removed his eldest son from existence for the crime of seeing too clearly, of understanding too deeply, of refusing to participate in comfortable blindness anymore. And John sat alone in his room, feeling the weight of what he'd lost. Inheritance, family, future, all of it gone. But feeling also something like relief, because maintaining those things would have required continuing to lie, continuing to not see, continuing to be complicit in systematic cruelty. And he couldn't do that anymore. The curse had made it impossible, had burned away every defense mechanism, every rationalization, every ability to compartmentalize, had left him raw and exposed, and incapable of the kind of willful ignorance that made participating in slavery possible. 19 days after Matthew was sold, John made a decision. He would leave the sanatorium, would go back to Georgia, not to the plantation, but to the quarters, would find Isaiah, would speak to the man whose prayer had transformed him, would ask what came next, what he was supposed to do with all this knowledge, all this witness, all this impossible burden of carrying the dead. He left at night, simply walked out. The doors weren't locked as carefully as they should have been. The attendants weren't as vigilant as they pretended. And John had learned something about moving through the world when you carried ghosts. People sensed it, sensed something wrong, something other, and they moved away, created space, allowed passage without meaning to, just responding to some primitive instinct that said, This person is marked. This person carries death. Stay away. He walked through Charleston in the darkness, saw the city with new eyes, saw the auction houses where families were torn apart, saw the grand houses built on enslaved labor, saw the churches where people prayed to a God they claimed sanctioned their cruelty, saw the whole structure of the city, the whole organization of society, all of it resting on systematic dehumanization, all of it dependent on some people being treated as property so others could prosper. And he saw the ghosts everywhere, the dead who'd built this place, who'd maintained it, who'd suffered in it. They crowded the streets, filled the squares, pressed against the walls of fine buildings, all of them watching, all of them waiting, all of them demanding to be remembered. He made it to the docks by dawn, found a ship heading to Savannah, worked his passage by doing labor nobody else wanted to do, cleaning, hauling, tasks that didn't require speaking or interacting, just endurance. And John had learned endurance, had learned how to keep moving even when every step felt impossible, had learned how to carry unbearable weight and still function, still breathe, still exist. From Savannah he walked the roads back toward Georgia, back toward the plantation he'd been raised on, back toward the reckoning that was still building, still intensifying, still preparing to reach some crescendo he couldn't yet imagine. 22 days after Matthew was sold, John Blackwood Jr. walked onto his family's plantation at sunset, walked past the main house without stopping, past his mother, who saw him through the window and screamed, past the overseers, who reached for weapons before recognizing him and then not knowing how to respond, walked straight to the quarters, straight to Isaiah's cabin, and knocked on the door like a visitor, like someone seeking permission to enter, rather than someone who technically owned everything, including the man inside. Isaiah opened the door, looked at John, and something passed between them. Recognition deeper than words, understanding that transcended the master-slave relationship, acknowledgement of transformation, of curse answered, of prayer manifested. Isaiah stepped aside, let John enter. The cabin was small, barely large enough for one person, certainly not designed for two. But John entered and sat on the floor because there was only one chair and it belonged to Isaiah. And they sat in silence for several minutes, the silence of people who've both been broken by the same system in different ways, who've both lost brothers to its cruelty, who've both discovered that surviving slavery, whether as enslaved or as someone who can finally see the enslaved as fully human, requires carrying impossible weight. Finally, Isaiah spoke. I see it worked, my prayer. I asked for sight, asked for understanding, asked for you to carry what we carry. And you do now, don't you? You carry us, see us, feel us. Can't unsee or unfeel anymore. John nodded. His throat was tight. Yes, I see everything, everyone, all the suffering, all the humanity that's been denied, all the deaths that nobody mourned, all the families torn apart. I carry it all, and it's destroying me. I don't know how to live with it, don't know what I'm supposed to do with this knowledge. You're supposed to do what needs doing. Isaiah's voice was quiet but firm. You're supposed to free us All of us. Your family won't do it, won't ever acknowledge our humanity. But you can. You have the power, have the legal right, can sign the papers that give us freedom. That's what the curse was preparing you for. Not just to see, but to act on what you see. To use your privilege for once, to undo what your privilege has done. I've been disinherited. I have no legal power anymore, no authority, no position. My father has made sure of that. Isaiah smiled, sad and knowing. Then you're one of us now, aren't you? Powerless, dispossessed, cut off from family and future. Welcome to what we've always known. But there's still something you can do, still testimony you can bear, still truth you can speak, even if nobody listens, even if it costs you everything. That's what the curse is asking. Are you willing to speak truth even when it destroys you? Are you willing to witness even when nobody wants to hear? Are you willing to remember us even when the whole world is trying to forget? John looked at Isaiah, looked at a man who'd lost his brother, who'd prayed for justice and somehow summoned this strange curse that had transformed John from comfortable heir to dispossessed witness. And John understood something fundamental. The curse wasn't punishment, was invitation, was offering him a choice, to use his suffering for something, to transform personal pain into testimony. To become the kind of witness the enslaved couldn't be because they were dismissed as biased, as unreliable, as not fully human. But a white man testifying to their humanity, to their suffering, to the systematic cruelty of slavery, that might reach people who wouldn't listen to the enslaved themselves, might crack the comfortable lies, might force some small acknowledgement of truth. I'll do it. John's voice was hoarse, but certain. I'll testify. I'll speak. I'll bear witness to everything I've seen and felt and carried. I'll make you visible. Make your suffering undeniable. Make your humanity impossible to dismiss, even if nobody listens, even if it costs me everything I have left. I'll do it. Isaiah nodded slowly. Then the curse has achieved its purpose, has transformed you from oppressor to ally, from participant to witness, from someone who benefited from blindness to someone who can't stop seeing. That's all we can ask, all we can hope for. Small transformations, individual awakenings, seeds of change that might grow into something larger if enough people choose sight over blindness. That night, John slept in the quarters, on the floor of Isaiah's cabin, surrounded by the people his family had claimed ownership over. And for the first time since the curse began, he slept without nightmares, without visions, without testimony from the dead. As if they recognized that he'd accepted his role, had committed to carrying them, had agreed to be their witness. And in that acceptance, they gave him brief rest, brief peace, brief respite from the constant weight of their demands. But the respite wouldn't last, because the next morning, John's father would discover where he was, would send men to remove him, would try to force him back into the category of respectable society. And John would have to make his final choice, would have to decide who he really was now, what he was willing to sacrifice, how far he would go to honor the curse that had transformed him. 23 days after Matthew was sold, John Blackwood Sr. arrived at the quarters with 3 overseers and a hired man from Charleston. A man whose job was handling difficult situations, removing problems, making inconvenient people disappear into institutions where they couldn't embarrass respectable families anymore. John was dragged from Isaiah's cabin, was held between 2 large men while his father stood at a careful distance and spoke like John was already gone, already dead, already removed from family memory. "You've made your choice. Made it clear you prefer degradation to responsibility, prefer madness to sense, prefer the company of property to your own kind. So be it. These men will take you back to Charleston, to a place where you'll be kept for the rest of your natural life. You'll have food and shelter. That's more than you deserve, but I'm not entirely without mercy. But you'll never leave. Never speak to anyone from this family again. Never have contact with the outside world. You'll simply cease to exist as far as we're concerned." John looked at his father, saw the fear behind the cold words, saw a man terrified that what happened to John might spread, might infect others, might crack the careful denials that made slavery possible. Saw a man who'd rather lock his own son away forever than risk having to confront uncomfortable truths. And John spoke clearly, loudly, making sure every enslaved person within hearing could hear him, making sure his words would be remembered and repeated, making sure his testimony would spread even if he was silenced. "I see them, Father. See everyone you've ever owned. See their faces. Know their names. Understand their suffering. And I'll carry them forever. You can lock me away, but you can't stop the truth. Can't stop what's coming. Can't stop the reckoning that builds every time you split another family. Every time you reduce another human being to property. Every time you profit from systematic cruelty. It's all been recorded, all been remembered, all waiting to be accounted for. And accounting will come. Maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not in mine, but it will come. Because suffering this deep doesn't just disappear. It accumulates, it demands payment, and the bill is coming due." His father's face went purple with rage. "Shut him up! Get him out of here, now!" But before the hired man could move, Isaiah stepped forward, stepped between John and the men who would take him, and spoke with a dignity that made John's father step back reflexively, before remembering he wasn't supposed to acknowledge enslaved people as having dignity or authority or the right to speak without permission. "You asked what John is willing to sacrifice." Isaiah's voice carried across the quarters, reached every ear, every listening person. "You see his choice as madness, as degradation. But we see it differently. We see a man who chose truth over comfort, who chose sight over blindness, who chose humanity over privilege. And that choice, that willingness to see us as fully human, even when it costs him everything, that's what your system can't survive, can't tolerate, can't allow. Because if one person from your class truly sees us, truly acknowledges our humanity, truly comprehends what slavery actually means, then the whole structure starts to crack. The whole careful architecture of lies and justifications starts to crumble. That's why you have to lock him away, not because he's mad, but because he's sane. Because he's seeing clearly, for the first time in his life, And clear sight is the most dangerous thing to a system built on blindness. Silence. Absolute silence. Every person in the quarters had stopped moving, stopped breathing. To hear an enslaved man speak like this to a master was unprecedented, was impossible according to every rule of how the plantation worked, should have resulted in immediate, violent punishment. But something in Isaiah's words, something in the way he stood, something in the presence of John marked with scars and ghosts and transformed by curse, all of it created a moment where normal rules suspended, where a crack opened, where different possibilities briefly became visible. Then the moment shattered. John's father nodded to the hired man. The man stepped forward with practiced efficiency, had a cloth soaked in something chemical, pressed it over John's face, and John's last thought before darkness took him was gratitude. Gratitude that he'd borne witness. Gratitude that he'd spoken truth. Gratitude that even if he was locked away forever, his testimony would remain, would be remembered, would be whispered in the quarters, would spread from plantation to plantation, would become part of the hidden testimony that slavery couldn't silence, no matter how hard it tried. He woke in darkness, complete darkness, underground darkness, the kind that presses against your eyes even when they're open. He was in a cell, stone walls, iron door, no window, no light except what came when someone opened a slot to pass food through. This was where they put people who needed to disappear, who couldn't be killed outright because that would create scandal, but who couldn't be allowed to speak, to testify, to crack the comfortable lies. This was burial without death, silence without killing, erasure without the mess of actual murder. John sat in the darkness and felt the ghosts gather around him, felt them pressing close, felt their presence thick as physical substance. And he understood that this was where he would spend the rest of his life, in darkness, below ground, removed from the world, but not removed from the dead, not removed from the testimony he carried, not removed from the weight of witness. He would carry it here, in the dark, for however many years he survived, would carry the names and faces and stories, would remember when the world above tried to forget, would be the archive, the memorial, the living grave for people whose graves had never been marked, whose deaths had never been mourned, whose humanity had never been acknowledged. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time lost meaning in absolute darkness. Food came through the slot. Water came. Waste was removed. The basic biological necessities were maintained, but nothing else. No human contact, no light, no sound except his own breathing and the whispers of the dead who kept him company. And John found that he didn't mind. Found that the darkness suited him, matched his internal state, reflected the truth he'd learned, that slavery was a darkness, a systematic denial of light, a deliberate obscuring of humanity. And he was living in that darkness now, embodying it, becoming a physical manifestation of what slavery actually was beneath all its civilized pretenses and economic justifications. He talked to the ghosts in the darkness, learned their stories in deeper detail. Sarah told him about her childhood before enslavement, about freedom she barely remembered, about being stolen at age 7 and sold south. Jacob told him about his wife who'd been sold away after 40 years of marriage, about loving someone for decades and then never seeing them again because an owner needed money. About dying without ever knowing if she'd survived, if she'd thought of him, if she'd forgiven him for not being able to protect her. One by one, they shared their full stories. Not just the moments of suffering, but the full complexity of their lives, their loves, their hopes, their small joys carved out of systematic oppression, their resistance, their survival, their refusal to let slavery strip away every trace of humanity, even when that was its explicit purpose. And John became the repository for all of it, became the living book where their stories were written, became the memorial they'd never received in life, became the testimony that would outlast slavery itself. Because he understood now what the curse had been preparing him for. Not just to see, not just to witness, but to remember, to carry, to preserve, so that even when the enslaved themselves were silenced, their stories would remain, would be held in the transformed consciousness of someone who'd been forced to understand their full humanity, who'd been made to carry their suffering as his own, who'd been marked by them so deeply that their testimony was now inseparable from his own identity. Months passed, maybe years. John lost track, lost the ability to measure time in conventional ways. But he felt himself changing, felt his consciousness expanding, felt the boundary between himself and the ghosts becoming thinner, until sometimes he couldn't tell where he ended and they began, until their memories became his memories, their pain became his pain, their stories became his story. He was becoming collective, becoming multiple, becoming a vessel for voices that had been systematically suppressed. And then one day, the door opened. Light flooded in, blinding after so long in darkness. John raised his hand to shield his eyes, heard footsteps, heard a voice he recognized. Isaiah. Isaiah standing in the doorway with keys in his hand and freedom written on his face. It's over. The war came. The Union won. Slavery is ended. Lincoln signed the proclamation. We're free, all of us. And I've spent 2 years searching for you, searching every asylum and prison and hole in the ground where they might have buried you. And I found you here, and now I'm taking you out. You bore witness for us. Now we bear witness for you. Now we remember you. Now we carry you. John tried to stand, found his legs wouldn't support him, found his body had weakened from years of confinement. But Isaiah caught him, supported him, helped him toward the light. And as John emerged from darkness into day, he saw the world transformed, saw formerly enslaved people walking freely, saw them reuniting with families, saw them beginning the impossible work of building lives after systematic oppression, saw them carrying scars, carrying trauma, carrying grief that would last generations, but also carrying something else, carrying survival, carrying resistance, carrying the refusal to let slavery define them completely. Isaiah took John to a small house, a house Isaiah had claimed for himself after liberation, had built with his own hands, had made into a home finally his own. And there, John slowly recovered, slowly remembered how to walk in sunlight, slowly learned to function in a world where slavery had legally ended, even though its effects would continue for generations. And as he recovered, he wrote everything the ghosts had told him, wrote every story, every testimony, every moment of suffering and resistance and survival. Wrote it all down with shaking hands that could barely hold a pen after years of darkness. Wrote it because the dead had demanded witness, had demanded remembering, had demanded that their humanity be preserved in permanent form. The manuscript grew. Hundreds of pages. Thousands. A comprehensive testimony to what slavery had actually been for those who endured it. Not abstract economic system, not peculiar institution, but systematic destruction of human beings carried out by people who'd convinced themselves it was righteous. John wrote it all, and when he finished, he gave it to Isaiah. This is yours. This is your testimony and the testimony of everyone who suffered on Blackwood land. Do with it what you think best. Publish it, hide it, burn it. It's not mine to control. I was just the vessel, just the pen. The truth belongs to you. Isaiah took the manuscript, held it carefully, and said something John would remember for the rest of his life. You gave up everything to bear witness for us. Gave up family and fortune and freedom. Let yourself be transformed and marked and broken. That kind of witness matters. That kind of willingness to see even when seeing destroys you, that's what changes things. Not armies, not laws, but individual people choosing truth over comfort, choosing sight over blindness, choosing humanity over privilege. You did that, and it cost you everything. But it also created something that can't be destroyed, can't be denied, can't be erased. You created testimony, and testimony lasts. Final scene. 10 years after Matthew was sold. John Blackwood Jr. stood in front of a mirror in the small house Isaiah had given him, looked at his reflection, saw a man aged beyond his years, saw scars that covered his body, saw eyes that held depths most people couldn't bear to look into, saw the physical manifestation of carrying others' suffering, of being marked by curse, of being transformed by testimony. But he also saw something else, saw purpose, saw meaning, saw a life that had been redirected from comfortable evil to uncomfortable witness. And he understood that the curse hadn't destroyed him, had transformed him, had taken him apart and rebuilt him as something necessary, something the world needed even if it didn't want it. A witness who couldn't be dismissed, a testimony that couldn't be denied, a living memorial to people who deserved remembering. He whispered to his reflection, words that had become ritual, words he spoke every day to remind himself why he carried what he carried. I see you. I see all of you. I remember you. I carry you. I honor you. I testify for you. And I'll never stop. Never look away. Never pretend you didn't exist or didn't matter or didn't deserve better. You were human. You are human. You remain human in memory and testimony and the marks you left on someone who finally learned to see. I am yours, marked by you, transformed by you, made into witness by you. And I accept that, accept the weight, accept the burden, accept the privilege of carrying you when the world tried to forget you. The reflection showed him clearly, showed the scars, showed the eyes that held too many perspectives, showed a man who'd been broken by truth and rebuilt as testimony. And in those eyes, if you looked carefully, If you allowed yourself to see, you could glimpse all the others, all the faces, all the lives, all the people who'd been enslaved and suffered and survived and died on Blackwood land. All of them there, all of them preserved, all of them witnessed, all of them remembered. The eyes of the ancestors looked out through John's eyes, and through those eyes they would continue to see, continue to witness, continue to demand that their humanity be acknowledged, continue to testify that they had existed, had mattered, had been fully human despite systematic denial of that humanity. And John whispered one final time, words that carried finality and acceptance, and something that might have been peace. I see you. I remember you. And I will remember you always.